Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode here on Tales from the Wandering Scribe. I am your host, Guillermo Garcia, otherwise known as the Wandering Quill and the Wandering Scribe. And welcome to April's episode of the Historian's Lounge. Now, this episode I am really excited to showcase today because my guest today is a first timer here on the channel. Now, for those who may remember my guest, he is a medieval historian specializing in faith and religion within medieval England, Europe, and the Middle East. He is also the author of Medieval Latin, a beginner's self-taught guide, and host of the Daly Medieval Podcast. And if that name rings a bell, it was also the same podcast where he interviewed me about my book, Amyntas, Son of Persia. Now, this episode will discuss his upcoming book, Medieval Saints and Their Sin, a new history of the Middle Ages through saints and their stories. Now, this is a very fascinating topic for me because I know very little about the role of medieval saints in European history. And to tell us all about that and more, let's give a huge round of applause to our guest today, Luke. Luke, thank you so much for coming on the show today.
Thank you ever so much for having me. It's ever since we last spoke, I've been wanting to get back in touch. So I'm glad that we can finally do it and get onto the topic of medieval saints.
Awesome. So let's just dive into it. So your upcoming book, Medieval Saints and Their Sins, is an examination of religion and saints during the early ages of when Christianity is adopted by the Western Roman Empire, all the way up into a certain point, if I'm not mistaken, the late medieval ages, or beyond that.
Yeah, so it starts off really with just a little bit before the fall of Rome, with St. Augustine, and takes you all the way through century by century until pretty much what I call the end of sainthood, which is then Martin Luther and the introduction of Protestantism, and where Christianity then really fragments.
Okay.
Yeah.
Interesting. So let's actually dive more into your book. So to help our readers and viewers understand, so how did you come up with the idea to discuss medieval saints and their sin? Because that's a very interesting title.
Yeah, it started off like my interest in medieval Christianity and stuff comes from university. Did a lot of essays and research on pilgrimage, medieval saints. One of my first ones though was about how cathedrals and monastic communities kind of manipulated and corrupted their saints. So for instance, in the book, you see St. Edmund, and how the monastic community makes money off of him. So that's how I kind of started that research. And then that fascination then took me to wanting to write a book. The book kind of started off in its very early timeline as a sort of fun, like 101 weird and wild saints, because there's so many out there, and it's such a wild topic. But the thing that's so amazing about saints is that they're often a microcosm for the wider themes going on. So, for instance, St. Cuthbert, who you see a large proportion of male pilgrims above the usual average. And the reason being for that is that St. Cuthbert was fairly misogynistic, and the community kind of kept that tradition going. So they act as these sort of little snippets, little case studies of these wider themes. And then so suddenly it was like, actually, you can tell a lot about medieval history and the different dramas, events, and themes going on through these saints. And so that's then where it was born from.
Fascinating. And as I said before, viewers on this, I know very little about medieval saints and the role they played in medieval Europe. And for those who may remember season 1, my first introduction to the study of saints and the history behind them was with my fellow historian and now doctor, well, she's already been a doctor now for a year, Dr. Chloe Agar, who studied saints in medieval Egypt or late antiquities Egypt during the reign of the Byzantine Empire. And that was really fascinating too, to study about the saints. And reading Luke's book, which again, thank you, Luke, for allowing me to read that ahead of time to get a good understanding for this discussion. You really get a chance to see, as Luke said, the history of the world through the eyes of these saints. And let's actually start with the beginning of St. Augustine during the last bit of the Western Roman Empire, because his story is very fascinating. So just a little tidbit for viewers, like St. Augustine from the book is half Christian and half pagan. He was raised with sort of like this hybridization, but later in life, he fully adopted Christianity. And that wasn't necessarily because of his choice. It was a lot of other circumstances at the time. And Luke, I was wondering if you could tell us more about that and why you decided to start with St. Augustine as like the beginning for chapter 1.
Yeah, so again, it kind of comes back to that idea of the microcosm. St. Augustine was born on the fringes of the empire. He lived in North Africa. He was Berber, Romanized, Catholic, Christian, pagan. So he was this real mixing pot, which was the empire. It was a time where many different faiths, Christianity, Zoroastrianism, all these different ones were circulating at the same time with all these different cultures. And so he perfectly kind of represents that. And so then you see this kind of turn kind of against him in a way. You see at the same time the tribes migrating into the Roman Empire because of the Huns, and what's happening with the emperors, with Stilicho and Honorius, and all of the different emperors that are involved, because there's so many successive emperors.
Right.
But within all that, you see boots on the ground, St. Augustine, seeing kind of this happening in the background and having this own turmoil in his life. And one of the great things that we have from St. Augustine is his Confessions in the City of God. 2 books which are brilliant to understand, like I say, boots on the ground, the history that was going on around them. And so you see Augustine toil with paganism, toil with the failures of Christianity, where he goes with it, and really in-depth insights into someone who was witnessing the known world collapse around him. And so, and especially for someone who was on the fringes of that.
Right.
And so he really is such a special character in terms of understanding the fall of Rome. And so whilst it's maybe not quite what historians would typically choose as the beginning of the Middle Ages, in many ways we would some may say that Augustine comes from that kind of classical era, and in many ways he did. But he also embodies then the Middle Ages, where Christianity begins to solidify, it begins to take a foothold in Europe, and become gradually to essentially dominate and put pagans' lives at risk, really.
Yes, and also another thing to also go into more depth, listeners, is actually the history of early Christianity in the Roman Empire. Now, many of us have been told, of course, the Romans in the beginning persecuted early Christians, and Christianity was put underground. But what is also fascinating is the rise of Christianity as becoming like the dominant religion. And that's a history of early Christianity that no one really explores, because when you really examine early Christianity, where they're now at the head and paganism is at the bottom, the roles are reversed. Early Christians, according to some historians, were primarily interested in destroying anything that was remotely pagan that did not follow what they viewed the true faith to be. And a classic case of that is, of course, in Roman Egypt, when Egypt also became another region of the empire which adopted Christianity. The early Christians took hold. And of course, that's immortalized in the film Agora. Now, for those who have not seen Agora, that was the destruction of the Library of Alexandria, all the knowledge, and you really see a different side of Christianity that we're not typically used to seeing. When we think of Christianity in the Roman era, we think of the martyrs, the ones who were persecuted. We don't really talk about them being now the dominant power. However, with that being said, even those at the top get trampled on by someone even greater. And we see that in St. Augustine's Confessions in his life. We see with the arrival of the Goths, the Slavs, the Alans, the other Germanic tribes that were pushed out by the Huns. And at this time, Rome was multicultural. Not a lot of native Romans from Italy were in the military. They were all half Roman, half Germanic, mostly Germanic. So the military, the might of the empire was drastically different. And of course, people in power, Theodosius the first, the Valentinians later on, greatly were not comfortable with that. And of course, you have the rise of the Arian Christians and all the other early subsets of Christianity that emerged, which of course led to schisms. And then we then dive into the Byzantines, which were Greek based, and they were heavily against Christianity. And their story with Christianity and religion and their saints is very interesting. So, Luke, I was wondering if you could tell us also about that too, with now the Byzantines being the, to lack of a better term, the focal point of the Christian world during the early, late antiquities into the early medieval periods.
Yeah, no, the Byzantines are a very interesting one, because when going back and looking at Augustine, you have the world collapsing, you have a mixing pot of faith, of culture, of language, and when you have an empire this vast, you need something to unify your people. Right. And so this was the primary, one of the primary focuses of Justinian, was to unify the empire within one Christianity. Because at the time, as you say, you had Arian Christians, you had Monophysites, then gradually Chalcedonians, anti-Chalcedonians, all these different kind of subsets of Christianity. And with his goal of recreating the empire, Procopius of Caesarea said that that Justinian was kind of from the divine commander that would remake the empire,
right?
And so, in order to hold it together, Christianity was to be that that kind of glue. And you see that, I mean, in many ways, this is what was able to be achieved in the Middle East with Islam, was that you have these vastly different cultures, vastly different languages, but they were all united through Islam, through Arabic, and through the Prophet. And so, going back to the Byzantines with Gregory the Great, who is then the one that we focus on, he very much so grows up in this world of Justinian. He grows up at a time where Christianity, the church, rather than being the kind of power like how we typically see, rather it's a tool. And so Justinian uses the church and uses religion to unify, or attempt to unify, his empire. He doesn't necessarily succeed, but Gregory, who grows up during this, when he then gradually becomes into a position of power, he then attempts to also unify Christianity. And so that this is where he sends envoys such as another Augustine to England, which then becomes a base of operations to spread Christianity to the natives there, to northern France, to Scandinavia, different places. So it very quickly, you see this pursuit to unify Christianity under one vast umbrella.
Definitely. And speaking of that, this also leads into another discussion, which I was very eager to share with you, which is, of course, the mantle of responsibility in terms of being the heralds of the Christian world. And I bring this up because you brought up a really good focal point, which is the Christian emissaries from the Eastern Roman Empire. And I use this term because it goes into my point, which is the emissaries from the Eastern Roman Empire, of course, spread Christianity into England, into Scandinavia, and to France, or Francia at the time. And this leads into an interesting discussion, which you have the rise of the Franks, which, of course, starts by the most famous ones are Charles the Hammer, and then eventually Charlemagne. And this brings into an interesting discussion when it comes to medieval saints and religion, is going back to, of course, the foundation of the Holy Roman Empire. And this is a really interesting discussion, listeners, because if you look at this time, you have the Eastern Roman Empire in the east, you have the Frankish Empire to the west. But here's the problem. Who is technically the rightful successor of not just the Roman Empire, which has been at this point, it's still in people's memory, but it's long gone. The idea of a Roman Empire is gone. But in terms of the faith, the Roman Catholic faith, who are the rightful inheritors? Now, for those who don't know this story, Charlemagne actively tried to sabotage the Byzantines from, or say the Eastern Roman Empire, from being seen as the successors of Catholicism, in terms writing them as the Byzantines, completely separate. And in turn, Charlemagne and his Frankish kingdom, with the help of the Pope and the story of him being crowned on Christmas Day as the Holy Roman Emperor, is a huge blow to the Eastern Roman Empire, who are now referred to as the Byzantines, because they're no longer seen as the rightful successors, even though technically they are, because they've had a more closer relationship with the West. The Franks, of course, were of Germanic origins, but they've adopted most of Roman culture to form into their own. So, Luke, how important is that discussion into the wider history of medieval saints and their sin? Because that is a huge turning point, like that shift between the East and the West, and would eventually lead to the Great Schism, the first Great Schism before Martin Luther, which is Roman Catholics and Greek Orthodox.
Well, as you say just then, it's something that really it impacts till today. You know, we use this term Greek Orthodox, we use Christianity, and we talk about them very differently. Whereas, as you say, they all originate from this one place. So what went wrong? What happened? And there's the book kind of meanders through the different kind of back and forth between the East and West to kind of show this. And one of the key factors in it was the rise of Islam, because it caused the East to flip between this whole period of iconoclasm and religious images, which saints were key in. So whilst the West retained its saints, retained its kind of traditional Christian views, the East floated with the idea of actually adopting sort of Islamic traditions. They saw that within Islam, that there wasn't any imagery around the prophet, around the God, and they had such an exponential rise. Maybe they were right. So they toil with the idea of maybe we need to scrap all of this gold, all of this, pageantry that we have, all of these saints, and maybe we need to kind of do a bit more like what Islam's doing. And so already from there, which is about the 7th century, you see a kind of departure. And then, of course, as you say, you have then the Frankish Empire, Charlemagne, the Holy Roman Empire. This kind of the Western world was built on Christianity. So whilst the Eastern Empire it saw its lineage as being Roman, we have to remember that the Franks were enemies of Rome. The kingdoms, the Visigothic kingdoms, were enemies of Rome. All of these people in Western Europe were enemies of Rome, so they didn't necessarily see their lineage as being Roman.
Right.
They did adopt it by all means. They adopted, for instance, the laurel crown, but Christianity was key to their centralization, their kingdom building, and their rise. And so to them, they then saw the Byzantines, who were obviously, as we say, kind of bringing this Roman essence, continuing it as an enemy, and their Christianities being different. And so that's where you kind of then begin to see this split of orthodoxy and Christianity.
Yes. And I don't know if your book touched about this, but I think it's an interesting discussion, which is, of course, there was a point in history where Charlemagne wanted to marry, forgot her name, but she was the queen mother of the Byzantine Empire. And there was a possibility of the two mixing. So you would have had the Greek Orthodox Roman culture mixed with the Holy Roman Empire, the Frankish culture. Of course, that didn't happen. But when discussing the history of religion and the late antiquities period, Luke, in your opinion, how different would Europe be in terms of studying religion? And do you think, even if that did happen, the Union would not have lasted because you had two conflicting viewpoints of how religion should be enacted? Both of them have adopted it in their government, and such, if they were united, which form would be the dominant one? Would it be Roman Catholic? Would it be Greek Orthodox? Or would it be a hybridization of the two?
I mean, that is a very loaded question. Gosh.
I know. Sorry.
What would it look like? I guess. So one of the things we have to look at is legitimization. So in terms of when we look at Christianity, one of the biggest, in terms of, if we were to look this at two different empires, two different kings, legitimization is key to power. So whether one is a usurper, whereas one, where they all source their legitimacy is incredibly important. Christianity in the West sources their legitimacy from the Vatican, from the Pope.
Right.
Now, the reason they chose Rome was primarily because this was the burial place of St. Peter.
Right.
So now two other places were toiled, one of which was obviously Jerusalem. The other, I believe, may well have been Constantinople. So Western Christianity, you could argue, has more of a legitimization based on that, based on the fact that they have the kind of burial place, St. Peter. They have the papacy, which creates the church more as an institution. Now, in the East, you have patriarchs rather than a pope. You have patriarchs. So you have patriarch of Alexandria, you have patriarch of Constantinople. So it's a little bit more fragmented in terms of its power dynamics. So you could say that because the Western religion was far more centralized, far more cohesive, that it probably would have overwhelmed the East. kind of see that with the Crusades when they established themselves in the Middle East. They very much so retain this kind of Western view, and likewise, you see that when the Byzantines are under threat, Christianity and doesn't really work well for them. They toil with the idea of moving the capital to the west. With the rise of Islam, they toil with different ideas of theology. With their fall, they toil with the fact that actually we'd rather be under a Muslim rule than a Christian one. So, obviously things like power dynamics, power structures, empire building, all of that comes into it. But I do think that we see in the book, especially, that the West is far more controlling, far more centralized, far more, as I say, cohesive as a religion that quickly develops, that doesn't necessarily develop, I think, in the East.
Fascinating. That's actually really, really interesting. And speaking of the rise of Islam, we can go back to that because I think that's a very interesting topic. Now, when discussing the rise of Islam and its relations with not just the Byzantines, but also Catholicism, your book also touches about, the spread of Islam into North Africa and, of course, almost into Spain, almost conquering it. And that I found really, really interesting. Now, to my knowledge, I said, I'm not very astute in the history of Islam, the rise of the caliphates, but with my limited knowledge, I understand that instead of the saints that we would imagine in Christianity, there are holy men, holy figures, and almost like Christianity and Greek Orthodoxy, there's powerful symbols. And one symbol I found interesting, and I don't know if you mentioned in the book, is, of course, the sword of Islam, the Zulfikar, which is a very, very powerful image, and the story behind it, which is fascinating, which I then also kind of leads into the story of saints, which is, of course, idols, which is either a bone, a finger, a robe, either a sword or part of it. So when we see that and tie it back with Europe, what is the importance and significance of items, or to use a proper word, idolatry, in the study of medieval saints and their sins?
Yeah, there's two ways to look at this. The first, which is an interesting one that I explore in the book, is kind of to dispel a myth about medieval Christianity and the Middle Ages itself, which is that people didn't blindly follow their faith. So I have a whole chapter on a fantastic character called Guibert Nongeon, who writes a really detailed, expressive, emotional text on relics. So it's called On the Relics of Saints, where he dispels, despite being a monk, despite being I believe he became an abbot, so a really religious man, he says and criticizes these, stupid, he calls them, these stupid idols. You've got, the baby tooth of Christ, for instance.
Right.
So although relics can be extremely powerful, we have to also understand that people were not necessarily blind to follow it. And that actually there was an understanding that some of these things were maybe more dubious. Now, on the flip side, they were actually, the ones that were deemed legitimate were incredibly powerful. So we turn, for instance, to the First Crusade with the Siege of Antioch, where you have a Christian army, depleted, starved, heavily outnumbered, and facing a attack from an army that knows the landscape, can cope with the heat and all this stuff, and is refreshed. But what happens is that miraculously, a relic known as the Spear of Destiny is uncovered, which was the spear that pierced Christ. And
Yes.
they carry this into battle at the head of the army. It creates such a kind of vigor and energy that essentially they win the battle. Despite everything being against them, they win. And so we see kind of in this twofold play where in many ways religious icons were kind of approved and also disapproved, criticized, but also they hold a very, very strong power. And yeah, definitely when it comes to saints and saint worship, icons do play a very important role.
Definitely, especially going a little tangent to the Crusades, especially with the story of like the true cross, the nail, all that stuff. It's like used as political power to say that our cause is just because we have this. And I always find that very, very interesting. And of course, you definitely agree with that. 9 out of 10, if we studied the history of the Crusades, it wasn't so much as legitimacy as it was, some would argue, an excuse to enact horrible amounts of political and religious terror. And it was just unsettling. But at the time, for those in power, they used that. And I find that very interesting, especially when it comes to some saints who were military men. And I always found that interesting too. The military saints who were these, sometimes on off chance, these were soldiers who were naturally good, who did struggle, but they learned to become good people, good men, and sometimes good women as well. However, on the other side, you have evidence of saints who were some of the most violent, cruel, vicious human beings, and yet they're venerated to the highest level of sainthood, regarded as these holy figures that we should look to. And probably one of my favorite saints to look into, the one that really introduced me to the idea of medieval saints, maybe going back a few years or centuries, is of course the iconic St. George. And no, not St. George the Dragon Slayer, even though that's probably the most common one, but St. George, the real St. George. And I found his story very fascinating. So, as a little tangent, what role do you think medieval saints play in the larger study of medieval saints?
Yeah, well, it's an interesting one you say that, just on the topic of kind of warrior saints, because again, that was, as with the icons, having a saint who was a warrior posed a very difficult question to Christianity, and it's something that we see with the rise of knights. Was that you have people like Gerald of Aurillac, who was a knight and killed people and drank and had wives and lovers and all this other stuff, led a very unchristian life, but became a saint and had to be treated as other saints would be. And we see his hagiographer, the person who writes about his life, struggle with these ideas and kind of is told to write about him, but doesn't necessarily know how to, because he has to pose these questions. If in the Bible it says thou shalt not kill, and we have a knight who spent most of his life killing, how do we rationalize that?
Right.
And so it's definitely a issue that they have to toil with. Yes, yeah.
It is really interesting. And I'm actually glad you brought up hagiography, because that is a really important study in the study of saints, like how these saints are written, how they are preserved. Now, I would imagine later on in your book, now into like the what we consider the high medieval age, it's a really interesting discussion of saints and sort of like their place in sort of like Europe. So if you can give us like a little overview of the role of saints or just medieval religion at the time of the high medieval age.
Yeah, so what the book I think shows, which I didn't necessarily aim to show, but seemed to emerge, was
Mhm.
the change that Christianity endures from the time of St. Augustine, where Christianity is a tool. It's just it's there, it exists, but it's not the main dominant power.
Right.
To then when we cut to the 13th century, 14th century, where the papacy is in full force, it's using saints to control the narrative and the populace. So rather than saints become that were just a feature of Christianity, now they themselves are a tool of Christianity. So we see from the Vikings that martyrs become extremely popular to try and reinvigorate the kind of religious energy within people, because obviously whenever, as we see with St. Augustine, whenever you're under threat, one of the first things you blame is that we've lost favor with God. So in order to control this, the kind of institution of Christianity then populates its kind of area with saints, and says, for instance, in the Crusades with St. Edmund,
Hmm.
the person died for his religion. God has not left us. Put our focus through our saints and use that energy to rid of these foreign invaders. And
Right.
so going into Christianity, we see, in those centuries, we see time and time again, whenever the papacy is under pressure, is under threat, that it turns towards its saints
Hmm.
as kind of way, as almost a scapegoat in a way, but as a
Right.
tool to be able to control the narrative and the populace, for sure.
Definitely. And speaking of that, another thing what I think is interesting to discuss is, of course, the cult of saints, because that was also an important period. And for those who don't know, the cult of saints is pretty much as the name states, like you had people, followers who were cultists, well, using the term now, or back then as well, who followed the saint, who had ceremonies, who venerated this person, who tried to collect every piece of artifact tied to this person, be it clothing, bones, anything tied to them. And that is a very interesting discussion. So, Luke, I was wondering if you could tell us more about that, as well as if your book touches on the rise of cultism in medieval Europe.
Yeah, so there's a whole chapter about what I call the golden age of saints, which is all about its kind of pilgrimage and everything. It's one thing, I guess, you have to remember is that when we use the term cult, uh, within medieval Christianity, it's not necessarily in the same way that we do now. So
Right.
when we talk about cult worship, you could argue in a sort of modern sense that these kind of hardcore followers of Taylor Swift, it's a cult worship.
Hmm.
And essentially it's just this idea of a group of people who venerate this figure, who go to see them, worship them, and develop all these ceremonies around it. And one of the things that we see is that, especially in England, is that 1066, the 11th century, is very key in kind of picking up its sort of the genesis of this cult worship, where you
Right.
have the introduction of hagiographies, of translation ceremonies,
Hmm.
of um, you know the development of pilgrim hostels, kind of pilgrim souvenirs. All these different things around cult worship begin to develop more rapidly, and you see a dramatic rise in the development of saints, where sort of, I guess, if you don't have a saint within 50 miles of you, then something's going wrong. But essentially what we see within this golden age is that people were on their feet, traveling so frequently. It's unbelievable. We kind of tend to think about the past in a sort of stagnant way, but actually what the cult of saints show is that, especially for instance with Thomas Becket, you had people
Hmm.
from all the way from northern France throughout Europe traveling to see and worship him because of these miracles that would supposedly happen. And so there's a lot of things that then quickly develop around saints that from the 11th century that we don't necessarily see before.
Right.
When we look, for instance, back at Gregory the Great or St. Augustine, he does have followers, but it's not in the sense that we see in the 12th, 13th centuries with, for instance, Thomas Becket, where there is this just whole pageantry where hundreds of thousands gather to celebrate the saint, celebrate his anniversary, and the kind of miracles that are surrounding him.
Definitely. And that kind of leads into another question I was thinking in my head, is the role of medieval kings who become saints. Of course, the one saint that comes to my mind is Saint Louis, the Sun King of France. His story is very fascinating, and he's just one of many medieval rulers who do become saints. So where do they fall into the study of medieval saints? Because it is kind of an interesting discussion, because he's a king, or was a king during his time after his passing, but he's venerated as a saint, or these men are venerated as saints in their native land. And sort of like, where do they fall into, like, in terms of worship? Are they worshipped as like a deceased king? As we know in some records, some people pray to like their kings, like, king, give me guidance. Or do you venerate them and pray to them as a saint, which that's a whole other discussion.
So what's interesting is with saints is that in a way that's a very umbrella term, because people went to different saints for different things. And we see that if we look, for instance, in England alone, we see that people went to certain saints for healing, other saints for protection, other saints for money, whatever it may be. A common one, for instance, is if you're sailing and you hit a storm, there might be a particular saint that then you go to. When it comes to then kings, a lot of people then go to them for protection, because you have again that warrior undertone. So St. Edmund, returning back to St. Edmund, who fought off the Vikings, well, failed to fight off the Vikings, but was a martyred king of East Anglia. People for centuries after, whenever there is a degree of strife, where they're under threat by invaders, whatever it may be, they go to him for that protection, that kind of warrior protection. And so when it comes to more religious men who become saints, such as Thomas Becket, you may see it more that people go to them more for healing. But then when you have those warrior saints, it's more for things like protection, that they would go to them for.
Definitely. And I'm going to bring this little slight tangent in that I think is really interesting discussion, because it kind of correlates to what we're talking about. It's like, where they fit in is, of course, the rise of military monastic orders. And the ones I'm going to mention are the Templars, the Teutonics, and the Hospitallers. And those were, of course, the big three. Now, there were many, many more military monastic orders, but those are the big three. And the reason why I'm bringing this up is that they're kind of almost like, the warrior saints that we've talked about, listeners and viewers, but also the kings and rulers and so forth, is that where do they fit into the study of religion? Like, these were initially created to protect pilgrims on their journey from Europe to the Holy Lands, what they consider the Holy Lands at that time. But over time, we see them becoming an independent powerhouse used by the Christian kings to fight against Saladin and his forces, the Fatimids, the Abuyids, the other Caliph forces. It's really interesting. But yet we see them become their own military force and their own independent identity. They have banks. They loan out money. They become their own thing. And then we sort of see this discussion of, the Catholic kings, of course, the French king didn't want to pay his debts, viewed them as Satan worshippers, idolaters, and so forth, and had them persecuted. And the reason why I bring this up is, of course, when you talk about religion, especially medieval period, it was tied to the government. It was tied to legitimacy. And anyone that said anything different was, of course, heretical. So for you, Luke, in your research, when does that discussion come about? This sort of like emergence of different voices saying, well, this isn't what the church is supposed to be. In the case of one of my favorite saints, Saint Francis of Assisi.
Yeah, so it's kind of looking at, I guess, in a sense, church and state. It's a very long history, which is shown in the book. So going back to the time of Justinian, we see the origins of the divine right of kings, where he says that he was instructed by God to, whatever it may be, to rule. And he writes this in his codex. Christianity then becomes to solidify and become its own institution. And when we cut to then the 12th century, when we look at the Capetians, for instance, we get a really, really interesting insight into the relationship between church and state through Abbot Suger of Saint-Denis and King Louis VI, Louis the Fat, where feudalism is shown to be far, far more complex than the pyramid that we typically show. Right. And Suger poses this idea that we need to limit the power of kings in order to make sure they don't get out of control. So this is part of what's known as the Gregorian reform, where these kings are kind of seeing this idea of divine right, of ultimate power, of absolute power, and sourced, legitimized through God. And basically the church is saying, actually, hold on a second, we don't necessarily want this, and instead is trying to make themselves the kind of peak of power. So whilst Suger says that everyone in Francia owes their allegiance to the king owes his allegiance to the church. So it kind of ebbs and flows in that way, of who owes allegiance to who. Then you get these religious orders, which are kind of, again, as we said before with Gerald of Aurillac, it's difficult to rationalize, but with the Crusades, again, religion becomes a tool. These saints are used to create a certain narrative, and ultimately religion is used as the basis of an attack on the Crusades, which allows them to expand and grow. And so then with these religious orders that then again grow in power, we come back to that original question about the role of church and state. Who can have that power? And especially by the 14th century, where we see the end of the Templars, for instance, it's all about this jostle of power where these kings almost unite and say, actually, we're taking back power. We're returning to kind of pre-Augustine, where religion was just a factor of life, of culture. It wasn't a power player, an institution. And really, power is held by us. And so that's where we see the Holy Roman Emperor Charles invade the Vatican. We see in France, they attack the Templars. We see it throughout. We see Henry VIII create his own church. We suddenly, by the end of the medieval era, we see the church really under threat, because there's a real power shift where religion is used, but it's kind of being fought over, really, between the church and the state. And it's all to do with these saints and where power is held.
Fascinating. And on the topic of saints, in your research, at that pinnacle point of like the shift in power, what saints really give the most detailed overview and explanation into this changing times, because it is a changing times, because as you said, it's a shift in power. The Rome and what we call the papal states emerge or have already been emerging at this time, and they have to exist. You have Sardinia, you have the Kingdom of Sicily, you have the Kingdom of Naples. Like, Italy was not united as people would like to think. No, they were their own individual kingdoms within a small peninsula. Like, truly, the epicenter was the papal state, which of course was Rome. And of course, for those who know, later on, the papal states hired the Swiss mercenaries, who later become the Swiss Guard, who defend the Vatican and the papal states. Like, that is their primary goal, is to defend the Vatican and to defend the Pope, because he is, like the kings in France, England, Spain, and so forth, he is the figurehead of Rome. So, going back again, what scenes were really interesting to explore and to add into this discussion into your book?
Yeah, it's I think what's really interesting is that saints become really key, especially when you have the Black Death
Yes.
that comes in, because that in a way really kicks off things. It's almost the genesis of all these later power plays, because you have the Black Death, which again people blame God, blame the church, about this plague that's come about. And this then gives leverage for these then power players to say, actually, okay, well, it's our turn to hold the power. And so the church then turns towards some of its most prominent saints: Michael, the archangel; Mary, Jesus's mother, but also others like Saint Sebastian, who are there to heal people and also battle off demons. Michael, the archangel, defeated Satan. So what better person to use in the face of this plague than someone such as him? You also see, in terms of I guess the wider uses of saints, there's people such as Simon de Montfort, who become venerized but are never truly become saints, but
Right.
people worship them, and they become symbols of anti-royalism. So for instance, with the Second Barons' War in the 1200s, you have then afterwards Simon is pretty much the focal point of anti-royalist sentiments. And so when people have a bit of an uproar, they kind of turn towards him. So again, when you thinking of these earlier saints who were protectors, they are then kind of reinvigorated during these times of hardship, between when the church and state were at arms together.
Right. And just a little tangent. I'm actually glad you brought up Simon de Montfort, because there's a huge possibility that that man may actually be tied to my own personal family, because my family's name is Montfort. Just a little tangent, because he is a very interesting figure. Because as you said, he was like the head of like the anti royalist sort of like discussion, of course, with John's son, Henry III, who was ruling England, and Simon, who grew up in France. His understanding of kingship and what it is to be a king, even though he wasn't a king, he grew up in the monarchy with St. Louis, the Sun King, and Queen Blanche. His understanding of kingship and like where does religion play into this is very different from England's point of view, which of course that's leading to the huge discussion with, of course, Martin Luther and his reforms, who say, this is not what the church is supposed to be. We need to break away. They have way too much power. They're dominating us. And do you also think it comes from like this disconnect because they are really far away? Rome is in sort of like the Mediterranean world, where it is like this melting pot, and the north, the German lands, the French kingdoms, they're very, very far away, and their understanding of religion is vastly different. So why is that, in your opinion, the biggest focal point, this fulcrum event in your book that is like the end all be all in this discussion of medieval saints and their sins?
Yeah, I think that when you look at it, when you take a step back and look at the wider timeline, and you see this rise, this golden age, and then this fall, that is, I split the book into three parts throughout from with that kind of way. You know, these ideas about the ways to rule and power heavily play into really the course that Christianity takes. We see by the end is pretty much almost a uniform destruction of Christianity, in a sense that, as you say, in the Holy Roman Empire, kind of Germanic, Central Europe, we see Martin Luther and various others deconstruct saints, deconstruct the church, scorn them, you know, for what they're doing, all this other stuff. We see John Wycliffe and others in England do the same, and they form the Church of England from Henry VIII. We see in Bohemia the Hussites,
Yes,
and reform and go counter the church because they believe in a certain way that they should rule. In fact, you actually see a kind of proto-communism there with the Taborites, where they live in a very small community, but one which sees no hierarchy. And then you see in the East, with the Byzantines that are finally taken over by the Turks, the Ottomans, you see its inhabitants say that they would rather be led by them than these useless Christians. And so the church is really struggling to keep a hold on all this. And also in the background, you've got the Black Death, you've got the Mongol invasion, you've got all of these different things closing in more or less all at once from everywhere, every angle. Most of it is to do with these ideas of power, where power lies, and all of it involves pretty much the legitimization of Christianity. And what we then see is a twofold outcome, where in Europe Christianity fragments, becomes the Church of England, Anglican Christianity, becomes Catholicism, Protestantism, Orthodoxy, all these different versions. But we also see is that then, in order to counter this and to create a tight hold and retain its traditions, Christianity then looks elsewhere and starts to venture to the Americas, to the Philippines, and create really Catholic, really strongly Catholic states, such as the Philippines, which even today is still very, very Catholic.
And that's actually really, really true, because overall, from this discussion, it seems like the role of religion and the saints is like you have their emergence, you have this golden age, and they're trying to hold on to power, and that they are like the epicenter of knowledge. They have all the answers. But then, of course, you have the Black Death, you have the Mongol invasion, you have revolts and rebellions. And for the common man, if you lived through all of this and religion couldn't give you the answers, it's a wake-up call. And it's like, we trusted you guys for so long, and you couldn't tell us straight what was the actual cause or what we could have done. You guys had your reign. Now it's our time. And I really see that in this book, that it's the discussion of, like, you know, religion as like the epicenter of like knowledge, understanding in medieval Europe. But over time, it's sort of like dwindles, not to the point where it's not existent, but the monarchy is still at the head, religion's still in the background, as like in terms of like, you know, legitimizing rule, the divine right of kings, but it's not the powerhouse that it once was at that time during the late medieval era into what we consider the pre-modern era. And so with all of that together, Luke, what is your hope for this book going forward when it releases?
Yeah, and I think all in all, it is to see why the world, why in a way the world is why it is, and why saints are really so important to understanding that world. Because from the earliest days of the 6th century all the way to the 15th, the kind of ebbs and flow of the events that happen, the cultures that rise and fall, the wars or whatever it is, can all be connected to saints and be understood through saints. And so there's a lot that really can be understood, really complex understandings and theories that can be understood, I think, a lot simpler through saints. And so that's what I hope, is that it's a kind of, not necessarily the typical way that you would necessarily look at this history. Usually is through kings and all the kind of wider scope of
Right.
things. But it offers a really insightful look at it, I think.
Awesome. Excellent. Well spoken. And I think this is a perfect way to end this Historians Lounge episode. Thank you all, my viewers and listeners, for joining us today for the last official episode for the month of April. Do not despair. May is just around the corner, and I have a whole lineup of guests which I am eager to share with you, but you'll have to wait until my newsletter drops sometime this week. As always, I want to thank my guest, Luke, for coming out and providing his expertise on this topic, which he is very passionate about. So, Luke, thank you so much for joining for us today. And where can people find and engage with you to be up to date with any episodes on your podcast or when the book should be officially released?
Yeah, well, firstly, thank you so much for having me on. In terms of where to go from here, people can sign up to my newsletter, which is on LinkedIn. So you can find that, which is a sort of talk about news and things that are happening and history connected to it. But it's also sort of a waiting list to be informed about the release of the book and get all sorts of exclusives through that. So LinkedIn is the best way. You can also find a lot of my things through my website, www.medievallatin.com. You can find all sorts of links to everything, Twitter and Instagram and all that on there. So
awesome. I will link all those down below in the description of this video. And I urge you all to go and check out Luke's channel and also check out my time on Luke's show where he interviewed me about my book, Amyntas of Persia. That was actually a great episode. It's probably still one of my favorite interviews to be a part of because I don't get interviewed a lot. So it was nice being on the other end of the camera. So I urge you all to go and check that out, as well as the other episodes on Luke's channel. And as always, thank you again, Luke, for coming onto the show and providing your expertise on this topic and sharing your love for history. I always love that with my guests who have a passion for history, because at the end of the day, this is what we do. This is our profession. We love spreading knowledge. We love informing our viewers. We love informing our followers about history because we love it. Because if it's not being talked about, no one else is going to talk about it. So we have to do it ourselves.
No, couldn't agree more. Absolutely brilliant. Thank you so much for having me. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you, Luke. And thank you all listeners for joining me on this incredible month in April. Be on the lookout for my newsletter, which will showcase May's lineup. And as my last bit of information, be on the lookout for a post on my Instagram and LinkedIn for the official cover reveal of my third book. I won't say the name, but it launches today. So be on the lookout. And until next time, this has been the Wandering Scribe and the Wandering Quill signing out. Like and subscribe, comment down below, and we'll see you all in May.